Hey guys, today I will be talking about cluster criticism. So just a little background on cluster criticism. This is a method that, quote, identifies patterns or clusters of terms and concepts in a rhetorical artifact to reveal key themes and meanings. According to Kenneth Bailey of University of California, Los Angeles, quote, cluster analysis seeks to divide a set of objects into a small number of relatively homogeneous groups on the basis of their similarity over variables. Conversely, variables can be grouped according to their similarity across all object. Um, Now that you have a little background on cluster criticism, I will now get into the key figures of this criticism. Obviously, as we know, Kenneth Burke, he's the main one that started this. He coined the term cluster analysis in 1945, and he used it to note what subjects cluster about other subjects. A quote from Dokan on page 6. In Burke's cluster criticism, the critic attempts to discover the reader's worldview by noting what subjects cluster about other subjects. So that is all from Burke. Another key figure about cluster criticism is Bernard Brock. He used cluster criticism to analyze imagery and clusters of that imagery to discover rhetorical motive. That motive I will get into later on the goals and benefits. Another key figure is Caroline Coors Campbell. She applied this criticism to examine rhetorical arguments. Now onto the key terms. Rhetorical critics like William Reichert, Sonia J. Foss, and Richard Coe, they describe cluster criticism as a process or a series of three interrelated steps. That first step is indexing, and that is when a critic can kind of go through such documents or artifacts and look for what Burke calls as key images or key terms. And this step always kind of begs the question of what is a key term. That quote is from Goldrick Jones. And we must choose these terms based on frequency and intensity in the text. A quote from Sonia J. Foss and a couple other of authors is the general consensus among critics is that recognizing a key term depends on that frequency or intensity. And judging off the frequency intensity, we must group the terms into conceptual clusters and kind of note what goes with what and what creates these associational clusters of those terms. A quote that I really love from Goldrick Jones about this is, quote, key terms can be linked grammatically, such as through conjunctions or the placing of terms together as a noun phrase. They can be linked semantically through similarities of wording, which Burke calls imagery bridges, or they can be linked rhetorically. And Burke calls it through parallelism, metaphor, patterns of organization, or also just the way people might associate a term with a certain particular social value. Now I will get into the process of cluster criticism. First, we must select an artifact. This could be a speech, an advertisement, a post on social media, etc. I analyzed a source that did cluster criticism on George W. Bush's one of his presidential speeches, and they basically clustered key terms from his speech into groups. So obviously we'd have to identify key terms and group them into symbolic clusters. This is kind of examining the chosen artifact to identify words or phrases that stand out. We group these key terms into clusters based on their frequency, intensity, or thematic relevance within that communication. One, like for example, in George W. Bush's speech, the authors would take out the political arguments that he used or political words that he used in the text and put those into clusters. And this is kind of just to analyze patterns to reveal the rhetorical strategy and the meanings behind it. And at the end of this, we want to examine how they interact and what associations emerge from that text. Onto the goals and benefits. Like I mentioned a little bit in the background, cluster criticism reveals symbolic motives. A great quote from Goldrick Jones If the general goal of cluster criticism is to identify a writer's motive for engaging in a rhetorical act, then, quote, motive cannot be separated from a group's desire to create discourses with the power to shape larger public attitudes, whereas William Benoit suggests to justify publicly the actions a group has already taken. And this is all really to just provide insight into how rhetorical goals and audiences are affected by this text within the cluster criticism. Onto the limitations. Obviously, there's going to be judgment of choosing key terms, which is going to lead to potential for bias. I think one key theme among all of our methods is there's going to be bias some way, somehow. But for cluster criticism, it is important because you can miss contextual associations within the rhetorical artifacts, which leads me into my next point of cluster criticism definitely works better for shorter text. The bigger the text it's more challenging because it's harder to identify the clusters. Just because if the context is a lot bigger, it's going to be harder to find key terms and fit those into clusters rather than if it was a small text. It'd be a lot easier to identify those key terms and put those into certain cluster groups. Onto the conclusion. Cluster criticism definitely helps everyone reveal rhetorical patterns. Definitely provides insight to symbolic motives and meanings, like I mentioned. But the main thing, I definitely think it helps individuals make more informed decision, especially in today's society with social media being at the forefront. It can help how messages are portrayed and help you kind of analyze text and put the certain words into key terms into clusters, which can help you in the long run. So yeah, thank you. That's it.